I gave them exactly what they wanted, and that was the moment they lost everything. The room was quiet in the way expensive offices always are, thick carpet swallowing every step, polished wood reflecting the soft afternoon light, and my son Daniel sat across from me with his fingers loosely intertwined, trying to look patient, trying to look like a man who had nothing to hide, while his wife Vanessa leaned slightly forward in her chair, her lips curved into that careful, polite smile she only wore when she believed she was about to win something. Mr. Collins adjusted his glasses and glanced down at the document in front of him, the final version, the one they had been waiting for, the one they thought they already understood. I could feel their anticipation filling the room, subtle but undeniable, like the hum of electricity before a storm. Vanessa's eyes flicked toward me for just a second, measuring, calculating, as if I were already fading from relevance, as if I had become nothing more than a signature, a step in a process she had rehearsed in her mind countless times. Daniel didn't meet my gaze at all. He hadn't done that much lately. Not since the conversation started shifting from how I was doing to what would be best for me. Not since the word assisted living began appearing in sentences that were supposed to sound kind, but felt carefully placed, like chess pieces moving across a board I hadn't realized we were playing on. Mr. Collins cleared his throat, and the sound seemed louder than it should have been, echoing faintly in the quiet room. He turned a page slowly, deliberately, giving the moment a weight it hadn't earned yet. Vanessa straightened just a little more, her posture tightening with expectation. Daniel leaned back, exhaling softly, as if the outcome was already settled in his mind. They believed they knew what was coming. They believed I had accepted everything they suggested, every subtle push, every quiet redirection of my life into something smaller, something easier for them to manage. And in a way, I had. I had nodded when they talked about selling the house. I had smiled when Vanessa mentioned simplifying my finances. I had even agreed, gently, that maybe I didn't need to handle everything on my own anymore. They saw compliance. They saw surrender. What they never saw was the moment I stopped being surprised. The moment I began to listen more carefully, to notice the pauses in their conversations, the glances they thought I missed, the way decisions were discussed just out of earshot, and then presented to me as if they had always been mine. It didn't happen all at once. It happened quietly, like dust settling in a room no one had entered in years. And once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. Mr. Collins looked up briefly, his expression neutral, professional, but there was something else there too, something restrained, as if he understood more than he intended to say out loud. His eyes met mine for a fraction of a second, and I gave the smallest nod. That was all it took. He returned his attention to the document, and when he spoke, his voice was steady, measured, carrying just enough authority to make every word feel final. As per the revised terms, he began, and I watched Vanessa's smile deepen, watched Daniel shift slightly in his seat, preparing himself for confirmation of everything they believed they had secured. They had spent months positioning themselves for this moment, shaping conversations, guiding outcomes, convincing themselves that I was simply following along. And I let them believe it. I let them feel in control. Because sometimes, the most effective way to change the outcome is not to fight for it, but to give people exactly what they think they want and wait for the moment they realize it was never what they expected at all. The first time I realized something had shifted was not during a dramatic conversation or a single careless remark, but on an ordinary Tuesday morning when the sunlight came through the kitchen window at the exact same angle it had for years, and yet the room felt unfamiliar, as if I had quietly become a guest in my own home. I was standing at the counter pouring coffee into the same porcelain mug Daniel had given me 10 years ago when he still believed small gestures mattered more than outcomes, and I heard their voices in the living room, just low. Enough that they thought I could not make out the words clearly, but close enough that tone betrayed everything they were trying to hide. Vanessa was speaking in that soft, measured way she used when she wanted to sound reasonable, and she said something about timing, about how it would be easier if everything was handled sooner rather than later, and Daniel responded with a pause before agreeing, the kind of pause that told me he already knew the answer before the question was finished. I did not step closer, I did not interrupt, I simply stood there with the coffee growing cold in my hands, and listened not to the words themselves, but to the certainty behind them. That was the moment I understood that I was no longer part of the conversation, I was the subject of it. Later that afternoon, Vanessa sat across from me at the dining table, her posture perfect, her smile warm in a way that felt rehearsed, and she suggested that perhaps it was time to start thinking about simplifying my life. She spoke about convenience, about safety, about how much easier things would be if I did not have to manage such a large house on my own anymore, and I nodded, because on the surface, everything she said made sense and I had always valued practicality. Daniel joined us halfway through the conversation, carrying his phone as if it were an extension of his hand, and he added that he only wanted what was best for me, his voice careful, his eyes avoiding mine, just long enough to confirm what I had already begun to see. They were not asking, they were guiding, and they believed I would follow because I always had. That evening I walked through each room of the house, slowly noticing details I had stopped seeing over the years, the faint scratch on the hallway floor from when Daniel learned to ride his bicycle indoors, the small crack in the window frame that my husband once promised to fix, but never did, the quiet weight of memories that had nothing to do with money or convenience or efficiency. I realized then that what they were offering me was not help, it was an exit, one that benefited them more than it protected me. And still I said nothing, because there is a difference between reacting to something and understanding it fully, and I needed to understand every part of what they were planning before I decided what to do next. Over the following days, I paid closer attention to the small things, the way Vanessa would lower her voice when I entered a room, the way Daniel would change the subject whenever I asked a direct question, the way decisions were presented to me as if they had already been made and only required my agreement to become official. It was subtle enough that anyone looking from the outside might have called it concern, might have called it family, trying to take care of one another, but I knew better, because care does not feel like being replaced. It does not feel like being gradually moved aside to make space for something else. By the end of that week, I no longer felt confused or hurt. I felt clear, and clarity has a way of quieting emotions until only intention remains. And once I reached that point, I stopped wondering what they were doing and started deciding what I would allow to happen next. I did not confront them, because confrontation would have given them something they could prepare for, and I had already learned that the most revealing moments come when people believe they are unobserved and unchallenged. Instead, I adjusted my routine in small ways that did not invite attention, but allowed me to see more clearly the pattern that had been forming around me. I began lingering a little longer in rooms after conversations ended. I paused in hallways when voices dropped just enough to catch fragments that were never meant for me, and I started asking questions that seemed harmless on the surface, but forced them to explain details they had assumed I would never notice. Vanessa was the first to slip, not in a dramatic way, but in the quiet confidence of someone who believes the outcome is guaranteed. One afternoon, she mentioned speaking with a real estate agent, and when I asked casually what prompted that idea, she smiled and said it was only to explore options, yet her tone carried the certainty of a decision already made. Daniel followed her lead more carefully, but even he could not hide the way he began referring to the house as something temporary, something that would eventually transition into a more practical arrangement. It was always phrased as concern, always framed as helping me avoid unnecessary stress, but the consistency of it revealed the truth. They were not discussing possibilities, they were managing a timeline. That realization did not upset me the way it might have before, because by then I had already separated what they said from what they intended, and the distance between those two things had become very clear. A few days later, I found a folder on the dining table that had been left just slightly out of place, as if it had been moved in a hurry, and inside were printed estimates for property value, notes about potential renovations, and a list of financial projections that extended well beyond anything related to my needs. My name appeared only in the margins, attached to phrases like transfer and transition, while the rest of the document focused on outcomes that benefited them directly. I closed the folder exactly as I had found it and returned it to its position without comment, because by that point I no longer needed confirmation, I needed timing. That evening during dinner, Vanessa spoke about future plans in a tone that suggested she was including me, while quietly excluding me from the decision itself, and Daniel nodded along, adding small reassurances that everything would be handled smoothly. I listened without interrupting, and even agreed when it was expected, because resistance would have slowed them down, and I wanted them to continue exactly as they were. The more certain they became, the less cautious they were, and that worked in my favor. By the end of that week, they were no longer hiding their intentions as carefully. They spoke more openly about logistics, about dates, about how quickly things could be arranged once I was settled somewhere else, and I realized that what they lacked was not intelligence but patience. They believed the situation was already resolved, and that belief made them careless. I, on the other hand, had no need to rush because clarity had given me something far more useful than urgency. It had given me control over how this would end, and once I understood that, I stopped reacting entirely and started preparing for the moment when their certainty would become their greatest mistake. Once I understood that their confidence depended on my silence, I became very careful about how I used it, because silence can either make you invisible or it can make you unpredictable, and I chose the second. I began to respond exactly as they expected me to, but never more than that. I agreed when agreement was required. I smiled when it was appropriate, and I allowed them to believe that their version of events was becoming my reality. Vanessa grew more comfortable with each passing day. Her suggestions became more direct, less wrapped in polite concern, and more structured around outcomes she had already accepted as inevitable. She spoke about timelines with increasing certainty, mentioning how quickly the house could be prepared for sale, how simple it would be to consolidate my accounts, and how beneficial it would be for everyone if everything was handled before the end of the quarter. Daniel followed her rhythm, not leading the conversation, but reinforcing it, adding small details that made their plans sound reasonable, practical, almost generous if someone did not listen too closely. I listened closely. One evening, as we sat in the living room, Vanessa placed a brochure on the coffee table, a carefully selected community with landscaped gardens and quiet walking paths. She described it as peaceful, as if peace were something that could be assigned to a place rather than earned over a lifetime. I picked it up and examined it with interest, asking a few questions about location, about cost, about availability, and I could see the relief in her expression, the subtle release of tension that comes when resistance disappears. That was the moment she stopped doubting herself completely. Daniel looked at me, then briefly, as if searching for something he could not name, perhaps a sign that I was still thinking independently, but when I simply nodded and placed the brochure back on the table, he leaned back and accepted what he believed was my decision. What neither of them realized was that agreement does not always mean acceptance. Sometimes it is simply the most efficient way to move a situation forward without interference. Over the next few days, I took small steps that appeared to align with their expectations. I gathered documents, I reviewed statements, I even mentioned contacting an attorney to make sure everything was in order before any transitions took place. Vanessa encouraged this immediately, suggesting names, offering to coordinate appointments, and I allowed her to do just enough to feel involved without giving her control. When I finally scheduled a meeting with Mr. Collins, I informed them casually, as if it were a routine matter, something that required no further discussion, and they accepted that explanation because it fit perfectly into the narrative they had already created. What they did not know was that this meeting was not about confirming their plans, it was about redefining the outcome entirely. As I sat across from Mr. Collins in his office days later, I explained everything not with emotion, but with clarity. I outlined the conversations, the assumptions, the quiet decisions that had been made without me, and he listened without interruption, his expression steady, his questions precise. When I finished, he folded his hands and asked me one simple question: what do you want to happen? And for the first time since all of this began, I did not have to think about the answer, because it had already taken shape in the silence I had maintained for so long. I did not want confrontation, I did not want explanations, and I certainly did not want apologies. I wanted truth revealed in a way that could not be denied or reinterpreted, and there is only one place where truth becomes permanent, and that is on paper, written clearly without emotion and read aloud when it can no longer be ignored. That was when the plan became something more than an idea. It became a decision, and once that decision was made, everything else fell into place with a simplicity that almost felt inevitable. Mr. Collins did not react immediately after I told him everything, and that was exactly why I trusted him, because people who understand the weight of decisions do not rush to fill silence, they allow it to settle until what remains is clarity. He leaned back slightly in his chair, reviewing the notes he had taken, not questioning my perspective, but organizing it into something structured, something that could hold under scrutiny if it ever needed to. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm and precise as he explained that there are many ways to distribute an estate, but only a few ways to ensure that intention cannot be misunderstood or manipulated after the fact. And I listened carefully, because this was not about revenge, it was about definition, it was about making sure that what I had seen, what I had understood, would be reflected in something permanent. I told him I did not want to remove anyone without reason. I wanted their own actions to determine the outcome. And that was when he paused again, just briefly before nodding in a way that told me he understood exactly what I meant without needing further explanation. He began outlining a structure, not complicated, not dramatic, but deliberate, a clause that would not announce itself as a punishment, but would function as one if certain conditions were met, a sentence that would sit quietly among the rest of the document, unnoticed by anyone who believed they had already secured their position. I asked him to make it clear, but not obvious, firm, but not emotional, and he assured me that clarity in legal language is not about how loudly something is stated, but how precisely it is written. We reviewed every detail together, from property to accounts, from timelines to responsibilities, and at no point did I feel uncertain, because every choice was rooted in something I had already observed, something I knew to be true. When the final draft was prepared, he placed it in front of me and allowed me the time to read it in full, not just the sections that mattered most, but every line, every word, because decisions like this do not leave room for assumptions. I read slowly, not because I was unsure, but because I understood that once this was signed, it would become the version of events that no one could rewrite. When I reached the clause we had discussed, I stopped for a moment, not out of hesitation, but recognition, because it was simple, almost understated, and yet it carried the full weight of everything that had. Let me hear. I signed the document without ceremony, without hesitation, and handed it back to him, knowing that from this point forward the outcome was no longer something that could be influenced by conversation or persuasion. As I left his office that afternoon, the air outside felt different, not lighter, not heavier, just settled, as if something that had been uncertain was now fixed in place. When I returned home, Vanessa was in the kitchen reviewing something on her tablet, and Daniel was on the phone in the living room, both of them moving through their routines with the quiet confidence of people who believe the future is already arranged. Vanessa looked up and asked how the meeting went, her tone casual, but her eyes attentive, and I told her it was productive, which was true in every sense of the word. She smiled, satisfied with that answer, and returned to her screen, not realizing that the version of productivity she imagined and the one I had just secured were not the same. That evening during dinner, Daniel mentioned scheduling another meeting with Mr. Collins to finalize everything, and I agreed without question, because by then there was nothing left to finalize, only something left to reveal, and I had already decided that I would let them walk into that moment believing exactly what they wanted to believe, because sometimes the most powerful outcome is not forcing the truth on someone, but allowing them to arrive at it when there is no way to turn away. After that evening, something shifted in a way that was almost imperceptible to anyone who was not paying close attention, but to me it was as clear as a line drawn across a page that cannot be erased. They had moved from planning to execution, and that meant every word they spoke, every action they took carried a sense of urgency that had not been there before. Vanessa began organizing small details with a precision that suggested she had already rehearsed the outcome in her mind. She made calls in the next room, speaking in a tone that was polite but efficient, confirming appointments, discussing timelines, mentioning figures that were no longer hypothetical. Daniel spent more time reviewing documents, his phone rarely leaving his hand, as if he needed constant reassurance that everything was progressing as expected. I watched them both without interruption, allowing their confidence to grow, because confidence has a way of revealing things caution keeps hidden. One afternoon, Vanessa approached me with a list printed neatly on white paper, her handwriting precise. As she explained that these were the steps needed to move forward, she spoke about transferring certain accounts, consolidating others, scheduling an evaluation of the property, and arranging for a gradual transition that would make everything easier for me. I listened carefully, taking the paper from her and reading it as though I were considering each point for the first time, even though I already knew exactly what each step represented. When I looked up, I thanked her for organizing everything and told her it made sense, which was all she needed to hear. The relief in her expression was immediate, subtle, but unmistakable, as if she had just crossed an invisible threshold that confirmed she was now in control of the situation. Daniel joined us shortly after, glancing at the list and nodding in agreement, his voice steady as he added that they would handle most of it, so I would not have to worry about the details. I smiled at that because it was such a careful choice of words, not that I could not handle the details, but that I should not have to, which sounded thoughtful, but functioned as something else entirely. Over the next few days, I followed their plan, just enough to maintain the illusion. I gathered documents. When asked, I signed preliminary forms that held no real authority, and I allowed them to believe that each step brought them closer to the outcome they expected. What they did not realize was that none of those actions altered what had already been decided in that quiet office with Mr. Collins. The real document had been completed, the real outcome secured, and everything they were doing now existed only on the surface. The night before our final meeting with Mr. Collins, Vanessa suggested we celebrate afterward. She said it lightly, as if it were a natural conclusion to a long process, but there was a sharpness beneath it, a certainty that the next day would mark the beginning of something new for them. Daniel agreed, immediately mentioning that it would be good to move forward and put everything behind us, and I nodded once more, because there was no reason to disrupt their expectation. That evening I walked through the house again, not to say goodbye, but to observe it one last time, without distraction, the quiet rooms, the familiar details, the weight of years that could not be reduced to numbers or transferred between accounts. I understood then that what they were trying to take was not something that could be listed or divided, and that understanding removed any remaining doubt from my mind. By the time I went to bed, everything was settled, not just legally, but internally, and when morning came, I dressed carefully, choosing something simple and appropriate, because this was not a moment that required display, it required presence. As we drove to Mr. Collins' office, Vanessa spoke about timing and logistics, her voice calm and confident. Daniel listened, adding small comments that reinforced her assumptions, and I sat quietly beside them, not withdrawn, not distant, but composed, because I knew something they did not, that the outcome they were discussing had already been rewritten, and that within a matter of minutes they would hear it in a way that could not be negotiated or undone. When we arrived at Mr. Collins' office, the atmosphere felt exactly the same as it had before, quiet, controlled, almost detached from the significance of what was about to happen, and that was something I appreciated, because moments like this do not need decoration, they carry their own weight. Vanessa stepped in first, her posture confident, her expression composed in a way that suggested she was already thinking beyond this meeting, as if the outcome had already been secured, and this was simply a formality. Daniel followed closely behind her, glancing briefly around the room before settling into his seat, his movements calm but purposeful, like someone preparing to finalize a decision he had already accepted. I took my place across from them without hesitation, not rushing, not delaying, simply present in a way that required no attention and yet could not be ignored. Mr. Collins greeted us with the same professionalism as before, his tone neutral, his expression measured as he arranged the documents neatly in front of him. There was no tension in his movements, no indication of anything unusual, and that was important because the strength of what had been prepared did not rely on anticipation, it relied on precision. Vanessa leaned slightly forward, her hands resting lightly on the table, her fingers still for once as she waited, and Daniel exhaled quietly beside her, his gaze directed toward the papers, as if trying to read what had not yet been spoken. Mr. Collins began with a brief explanation outlining the purpose of the meeting in clear terms, confirming that everything had been reviewed and was ready to be presented, and they both nodded almost immediately, their agreement automatic, their confidence intact. I remained silent, not because I had nothing to say, but because everything that needed to be said was already written and would soon be heard in a way that could not be softened or redirected. As he turned the first page, Vanessa's eyes followed the movement closely, her attention sharp, her expectation evident in the way she held her breath just slightly longer than necessary. Daniel shifted in his chair, adjusting his posture, as if preparing himself for confirmation of everything they had worked toward. The room remained still as Mr. Collins continued, his voice steady, each word delivered with the same deliberate clarity that had defined every step leading to this moment. There were no dramatic pauses, no unnecessary emphasis, just a sequence of statements building quietly towards something that neither of them questioned because they believed they already understood where it would lead. I watched them carefully, not with judgment, but with recognition, because this was the point where certainty often becomes vulnerability, the moment when people stop analyzing and start assuming. Vanessa's expression softened into something almost satisfied, her shoulders relaxing just enough to reveal that she had already begun to move past this moment in her mind, and Daniel mirrored that ease, his attention steady but no longer searching. They were comfortable, and that comfort was exactly what allowed everything to unfold as it should. When Mr. Collins reached the section that mattered most, there was no change in his tone, no signal that anything significant was about to be revealed, and that was intentional, because truth does not always arrive with warnings. Sometimes it simply appears in the middle of what seems familiar and changes everything without raising its voice. He adjusted the page slightly and continued reading, his words carrying the same calm authority as before, and in that instant I could see the shift begin, not in what was said, but in how it was received, because there is a moment when expectation meets reality and realizes they are not the same, and that moment does not need to be announced, it only needs to exist. The change did not happen all at once. It unfolded in a series of small, precise moments that could easily be missed by anyone who was not watching closely, but I was watching closely, and I saw at the instant Vanessa's expression shifted from quiet satisfaction to something less certain. It began with a subtle tightening around her eyes as Mr. Collins continued reading, his voice steady, unchanged, as if nothing unusual had occurred, and that was exactly what made the moment so powerful, because there was no signal, no warning, just a gradual realization forming in silence. Daniel leaned forward slightly, his attention sharpening as he followed along, trying to reconcile what he was hearing with what he expected to hear, and for the first time since we entered the room his composure was no longer automatic, it was deliberate. Vanessa glanced at him briefly, a quick exchange of uncertainty that passed between them, without words, and then returned her focus to Mr. Collins, as if looking directly at the source might correct what she believed to be a misunderstanding. But there was no misunderstanding. The clause had been written exactly as intended, clear, precise, and impossible to interpret in any way other than what it stated. Mr. Collins did not pause, he did not emphasize the sentence, he simply read it with the same calm authority as everything that came before, and that was enough. Vanessa's posture changed almost imperceptibly, her shoulders no longer relaxed, her hands no longer still, as her fingers pressed lightly against the edge of the table, as if grounding herself in something tangible. Daniel's expression followed a similar path, his brow tightening just slightly as he processed the implications, not reacting outwardly, but no longer certain in the way he had been moments before. The room remained quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet, now not the confident stillness of expectation, but the heavy silence of recognition. I did not move, I did not speak, I simply observed, because this was not a moment that required participation, it required presence. Vanessa shifted again, this time more noticeably, her voice almost forming a question before stopping, as if she understood that interrupting would not change what had already been stated. Daniel exhaled slowly, his gaze dropping to the document in front of him, as if searching for something. He might have missed something that could restore the version of events he had already accepted. But there was nothing to find because everything had been written with intention and nothing had been left open to assumption. Mr. Collins continued reading, moving past the clause without hesitation, allowing it to settle naturally into the sequence of the document, and that was when the full weight of it began to take hold, not in a dramatic reaction, but in the absence of one, because sometimes the most definitive realization is the one that leaves no room for immediate response. Vanessa leaned back slightly, her expression composed, but no longer certain, her earlier confidence replaced by a careful stillness, as if she were recalibrating her understanding in real time. Daniel remained quiet, his focus fixed on the page, his thoughts clearly moving through possibilities that no longer aligned with what he had expected. I watched them both, not with satisfaction, not with judgment, but with clarity, because this was the moment where everything became exactly what it was, without explanation, without persuasion, without negotiation. The truth had not been forced, it had simply been presented, and now it existed in a form that could not be ignored or undone. And in that quiet, controlled space where every word carried weight, I understood that nothing more needed to be said, because what mattered most had already been heard. No one spoke for several seconds after Mr. Collins finished reading, and that silence carried more weight than anything they could have said, because it confirmed what they were only beginning to understand, that the outcome they had been so certain of no longer belonged to them. Vanessa was the first to move, though even that movement was controlled, as she straightened slightly, her expression carefully composed, as if she could still guide the situation back into something familiar. She glanced at Daniel again, but this time there was no shared confidence between them, only a quiet question that neither of them seemed ready to voice. Daniel finally lifted his head, his eyes moving from the document to Mr. Collins, and then to me, as if searching for clarification that would make sense of what he had just heard. His voice when he spoke was measured, but no longer steady as he asked if there had been some kind of adjustment, some revision he had not been aware of. Mr. Collins answered calmly, explaining that the document reflected the final and complete intentions as they had been formally established, and that every clause had been reviewed and confirmed. There was no hesitation in his response, no ambiguity that could be interpreted in their favor. Vanessa inhaled slowly, her fingers tightening slightly against the edge of the table before she spoke, her tone still polite, but edged with something sharper as she asked for clarification on the specific condition that had just been read. Mr. Collins turned the page and pointed to the exact line, his explanation precise and direct as he reiterated the language exactly as it had been written, leaving no room for reinterpretation. That was when the realization settled fully, not as a sudden reaction, but as a gradual acceptance that there was no alternate version waiting to replace this one. Daniel leaned back in his chair, his posture no longer confident, but contained, as if he were holding something in place internally while he processed the implications. Vanessa remained forward, but her earlier certainty had dissolved into calculation, her eyes moving quickly between the document and Mr. Collins, as if searching for something that could be adjusted or negotiated. There was nothing to adjust. I remained where I was, my hands resting lightly in my lap, my expression unchanged, because this was never about confrontation, it was about completion, and completion does not require explanation. After a moment, Daniel spoke again, this time more quietly, asking if there was any flexibility, any possibility of revisiting the terms, and Mr. Collins responded with the same calm professionalism, explaining that the document had been executed in full accordance with all necessary standards and that its provisions were not subject to informal revision. Vanessa said nothing after that, her silence no longer strategic but reflective, as if she were recalculating everything that had led to this moment and realizing that each step had been built on an assumption that was never guaranteed. The room returned to stillness, but it was no longer the same stillness we had entered with. It was something final, something settled. I stood slowly, not to make a statement, but because there was nothing left to remain seated for, and when Daniel looked at me again, there was something in his expression that had not been there before, not anger, not accusation, but recognition. I met his gaze for a brief moment, not to explain, not to justify, but simply to acknowledge that what had happened was not sudden, it was the result of everything that had come before. Then I turned and walked toward the door, leaving the document where it belonged, because I had not taken anything from them. I had only allowed them to arrive exactly where their own choices had been leading them all along.